The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dustwater as the funeral procession made its way to the cemetery on the hill. The black hearse, pulled by two matching bay horses, creaked and groaned with each turn of its wheels. Behind it walked Nora Whitlow, her widow's weed stark against the bleached earth, her pale face hidden beneath a heavy veil. The townspeople lined both sides of the street, their whispers carrying on the hot desert wind like tumbleweeds. "Look at her, walking all proper-like," muttered Mrs. Abigail Thornton to her companion. "As if we don't all know what she is." "Cold as January frost," agreed Martha Brennan, fanning herself with a worn handkerchief. "Poor Samuel Whitlow. God rest his soul. Found him with a bullet in his back. They did. And her, not a tear shed. I heard tell." Nora kept her eyes forward, her gloved hands clasped before her. She'd learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Not in Dustwater, where weakness was devoured faster than water in the desert sun. Let them whisper. Let them judge. They knew nothing of the nights she'd endured in that grand house, nothing of the bruises hidden beneath silk and lace. Sheriff Tom McKenna tipped his hat as she passed, one of the few gestures of respect she'd received that day. The banker's widow might be wealthy, but wealth without a man's protection made her nothing more than prey in a town like this. Dustwater sprawled across the valley like a festering wound, its buildings weathered by sand and time. The copper mine at the eastern edge belched smoke into the azure sky, feeding the town's appetite for commerce. At its heart stood the Dustwater Savings and Loan, Samuel Whitlow's kingdom, built on foreclosures and broken dreams. The bank's white-painted facade gleamed like bones in the desert, a monument to prosperity in a land that killed the weak. The cemetery gates creaked open, revealing rows of wooden crosses and the occasional stone marker for those who could afford permanence in death. The grave diggers had worked through the night, carving out a hole in the hard-packed earth beside the Whitlow family plot. Reverend Josiah Hayes cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing above his sweat-stained collar. "Dearly beloved, we gather here to commend our brother Samuel to the Lord's keeping." Nora barely heard the words. Through her veil, she watched the horizon where the Elkhorn Mountains rose like ancient sentinels. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay freedom, though she'd never tasted it. Married at 17 to a man chosen by her father, she'd traded one cage for another. Prettier, perhaps, but no less confining. As the Reverend droned on about Samuel's virtues, his business acumen, his civic pride, his generous tithing, Nora felt eyes upon her. Not the collective gaze of the crowd, but something more focused, more intense. She turned slightly, scanning the mourners. There, at the edge of the gathering, stood a figure she didn't recognize. A tall man in a black duster, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He held the reins of a black stallion, the animal's coat gleaming like obsidian in the harsh light. While others whispered and shifted, he remained motionless, watching. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The first handful of dirt struck the coffin with a hollow thud. Nora stepped forward, took her own handful, and let it fall. The crowd held its breath, waiting for tears, for collapse, for any sign of proper feminine grief. She gave them nothing. As the gathering dispersed, people flowing back toward town like water seeking its level. Benjamin Cross approached. The bank's vice president had vulture's eyes and hands that lingered too long when helping ladies into carriages. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Please accept my deepest condolences. Samuel was, well, we'll all miss his leadership at the bank." "Thank you, Mr. Cross." Her voice emerged steady, colorless. "I hope you'll not think me indelicate, but there are matters requiring attention. The bank's board will need to meet. Decisions about Samuel's holdings, the mortgage portfolio." He leaned closer, his breath sour with tobacco and something else. "A woman alone. Well, it's not seemly. Perhaps you'd allow me to guide you through these troubled waters?" Before Nora could respond, the stranger in black moved. He didn't approach directly, simply walked his horse between them and the cemetery gates. forcing Cross to step back. The man's eyes, gray as winter storm clouds, met Cross's briefly. Something passed between them, silent but unmistakable. Cross paled, mumbled excuses, and hurried away. The stranger mounted his horse with fluid grace and rode toward town without a backward glance. Nora watched him go, memorizing the set of his shoulders, the way he moved as one with his mount. In a town full of words, his silence spoke volumes. The grand house on Maple Street stood empty and accusatory when Nora returned. Samuel had built it as a monument to his success, 3 stories of imported lumber and glass, with a wraparound porch and gardens that required precious water to maintain. Now it felt like a mausoleum, every room holding memories she'd rather forget. She moved through the parlor, past the horsehair sofa where Samuel had entertained his business associates, past the drinks cabinet where he'd fortified himself before coming to her room. The servants had been dismissed the day after his death. She couldn't afford to keep them, and their pitying looks had grown unbearable. In the kitchen, she built a small fire and set water to boil. Tea, she'd learned, could make almost anything bearable. As she waited, she heard horses outside. Through the window, she glimpsed Edgar Hollis and 2 other men from the bank, their faces grave as they studied the house like assessors. They'd come soon. She knew. Without Samuel's protection, without a male heir, she was merely an obstacle to be removed. The law might say the property was hers, but law bent easily in the hands of determined men with money and influence. That night, Nora sat by her bedroom window, watching the town settle into darkness. Oil lamps flickered in windows, and somewhere a dog barked at shadows. The saloon's tinny piano drifted on the wind, mixing with laughter and the occasional shout. At the edge of town, where civilization surrendered to wilderness, a small light glowed. The old Baker cabin, abandoned for years after the Apache raids. Someone had taken residence there, someone who valued solitude over society. She knew without questioning who it was. Jack Renner. She'd learned his name from hushed conversations at the general store. A man who'd ridden out of nowhere, speaking to no one, acknowledging no one. The war had broken something in him, they said, or maybe he'd broken something in the war. Whispers spoke of a Union cavalry unit ambushed in Virginia, of a sergeant who'd survived by playing dead among his brother's corpses, who'd tracked his ambushers for months before justice or vengeance caught up with them. True or not, the stories kept people at a distance, which seemed to suit him fine. Nora understood the appeal of silence, the freedom in being unreachable. How many times had she bitten her tongue when Samuel demanded conversation over dinner? How many opinions had she swallowed like bitter medicine? She prepared for bed mechanically, brushing her dark hair the required 100 strokes, washing her face with rose water that seemed a mockery in this harsh land. In the mirror, she saw what others saw, beauty unmarred by childbearing, skin still smooth at 26, barren. Samuel had called her useless, a pretty ornament that couldn't fulfill its purpose. Sleep came fitfully, bringing dreams of hoofbeats in the darkness, not the chaotic thunder of many horses, but the steady rhythm of a single mount, circling the house like a guardian or a predator. She woke several times, certain she heard that sound in the waking world, but the windows revealed only empty streets and star-drunk skies. Near dawn, she rose and wrapped herself in a shawl, drawn to the window by some instinct older than reason. There, in the gray between night and morning, she saw him. Jack Renner sat his black horse at the corner of Maple and Main, still as a statue, facing her house. How long had he been there? What vigil did he keep? As the first rays of sun touched the mountains, he turned his mount and rode back toward his cabin, leaving only dust motes dancing in the growing light. Nora pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching until horse and rider disappeared into the landscape. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a gray dress that suggested mourning without the theatrical black of full widow's weeds. There would be accounts to settle, suppliers to pay, decisions to make. Samuel's death had freed her from one prison, but the bars of the next were already forming. At the bank, She found chaos disguised as order. Benjamin Cross sat behind Samuel's desk as if he'd always belonged there. Papers spread before him like battle plans. "Ah, Mrs. Whitlow. How unexpected." His smile held too many teeth. "I was just reviewing your husband's loans. It seems there are some irregularities." Irregularities?" She kept her voice level, though her heart began to race. "Missing documentation, questionable collateral assessments. Nothing that can't be resolved. Of course, but it will take time. And cooperation." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "A woman of your delicate sensibilities shouldn't have to concern herself with such matters. Perhaps we could arrange a more suitable situation." The meaning hung between them like a noose. Surrender the property, accept whatever pittance they offered, disappear quietly, or fight and risk accusations that could destroy what little standing she had left. "I'll review the documents myself," she said. "My husband taught me to read contracts quite thoroughly." Cross's expression soured. "As you wish, but remember, Mrs. Whitlow, Dustwater can be an unforgiving place for those who stand alone." She left the bank with her spine straight and her hands trembling. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, and dust devils danced in the street like mocking spirits. At Larson's general store, she purchased flour, salt, and ammunition for the derringer Samuel had given her years ago. "For protection," he'd said, never guessing she'd contemplated using it on him. As she emerged, Jacob Thornton blocked her path. The store owner's son had whiskey on his breath despite the early hour, and his eyes traveled her form with proprietary interest. "Mrs. Whitlow, all alone now, ain't you?" He swayed slightly, reaching for her arm. "Pretty woman like you needs looking after. I could—" The words died as a shadow fell across them. Jack Renner stood 3 feet away, his presence sudden as a thunderclap. He said nothing, made no threatening gesture, simply existed in that space with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken. Jacob stumbled backward, his bravado evaporating. "I didn't, just offering condolences." He fled, leaving Nora facing her silent protector. She met those storm-gray eyes, searching for intention, for meaning. His face might have been carved from the mountain stone, weathered, hard, but not unkind. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, silver against sun-darkened skin. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so slight she might have imagined it, then walked away. "Wait," she called, surprising herself. He paused but didn't turn. "Thank you," she said to his back. He continued walking, but she thought perhaps his stride carried slightly less tension than before. That night, she dreamed again of hoofbeats, but now they felt like a promise rather than a threat. The sound of something wild calling to something caged, patient as the desert itself, waiting for her to find the courage to answer. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by young Timothy Walsh, who wouldn't meet Nora's eyes as he handed over the official-looking envelope. The Dustwater Savings and Loan seal glared up at her like an accusation. She read it twice before the words truly registered. 30 days. They were giving her 30 days to either remarry and transfer the property to her new husband, or sign over all holdings to the bank to settle outstanding debts that had mysteriously appeared in Samuel's accounts. "Vultures," she whispered, crumpling the paper. They hadn't even waited for the ground to settle over his grave. The next morning brought visitors. Judge Cornelius Hammond arrived first, his black suit impeccable despite the dust that coated everything in Dustwater. He sat in her parlor, hat balanced on his knee, speaking in the measured tones of a man who'd already decided the outcome. "Mrs. Whitlow, you must understand the position. A woman alone, managing such substantial holdings. It's simply not done. The bank has the community's interests at heart, and their own pockets," she said quietly. His face hardened. "That's precisely the kind of talk that concerns us. Your husband was a pillar of this community. His legacy deserves better than to be squandered by feminine hysteria." After he left, they came in succession. Edwin Marsh, who owned the largest ranch outside town. Dr. Elias Cartwright, whose wife had died in childbirth 3 months prior. Even Reverend Hayes, sweating through his collar as he suggested that perhaps the Lord intended her to find new protection under a godly man's authority. Each proposal came wrapped in different words, but the meaning remained constant. Surrender yourself to gain safety, or resist and be destroyed. Nora received them all with icy courtesy, serving tea from her best china, speaking when spoken to, offering neither acceptance nor outright refusal. But inside, something wild and desperate grew. She'd survived one marriage that nearly killed her soul. She wouldn't willingly enter another. On the 4th night after the letter arrived, she sat at Samuel's desk, trying to make sense of the ledgers. The numbers swam before her eyes, loans to names she didn't recognize, payments to companies that might not exist. Samuel had been meticulous about his legitimate business. These chaotic records spoke of something else entirely. A soft thud outside made her look up. On the porch lay a leather pouch, heavy with promise. She opened the door cautiously, peering into the darkness. Nothing moved, but she sensed presence like heat from a banked fire. Inside the pouch, gold coins caught the lamplight, enough to buy passage anywhere, enough to start over. A single piece of paper bore 2 words in blocky script: "Leave tonight." She held the note, studying the awkward letters, written by someone unaccustomed to writing, or perhaps by someone deliberately disguising their hand, but she knew who'd left it, as surely as she knew her own heartbeat. The money sat on the desk like a question. Running would mean admitting guilt, accepting the story they'd craft about the banker's widow who fled with stolen funds. Staying meant something worse, slow suffocation in a trap of their making. She'd almost decided, was reaching for her traveling case, when hoofbeats thundered up Maple Street. Through the window, she saw torches, a dozen riders led by Benjamin Cross. They dismounted with purposeful efficiency, and Cross's voice carried clearly through the still air. "Mrs. Whitlow, open this door in the name of the law." She grabbed the pouch of gold, Samuel's derringer, and nothing else. The back door led to the garden, then the alley beyond, but they'd anticipated that. 2 men waited there, grinning like wolves who'd cornered a rabbit. Going somewhere. Widow? One stepped forward, reaching for her. The shot came from the shadows, precise and devastating. The man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. His partner raised his rifle, searching for the source. When Jack Renner emerged from the darkness like something out of legend, he moved with economical violence, the rifle butt crushing the second man's jaw before he could fire. Jack's eyes found hers across the fallen bodies, and he jerked his head toward the alley's mouth where his black stallion waited alongside a saddled mare. "My things," she began. He shook his head sharply, already moving. Behind them. Cross's voice rose in fury as the front door splintered. Nora hiked up her skirts and ran, Jack boosting her into the mare's saddle before mounting his own horse. They rode hard through empty streets, the sound of pursuit growing behind them. Jack led her not toward the main road, but up into the maze of mining trails that scarred the hillsides. The horses picked their way through darkness, sure-footed despite the treacherous path. An hour out of town, Jack raised his hand for halt. Far below, torches moved like fireflies, searching the main roads. He dismounted and adjusted her saddle, checking the girth with professional care. This close, she could smell leather and gunpowder, see the gray threading through his dark hair. "Why?" she asked. He paused, hand on the mare's neck. When he looked at her, something raw flickered in his eyes before the shutters came down again. He touched his throat, a gesture that somehow conveyed what words couldn't. He'd lost his voice, but not his ability to see injustice. They rode through the night, stopping only to water the horses at a hidden spring. As dawn approached, the landscape transformed from desert scrub to pine forest. The Elkhorn Mountains rose before them, promises of sanctuary in their ancient peaks. Jack led her to a narrow canyon invisible from the main trail. They climbed steadily, the horses laboring but game, until they reached a plateau where a small cabin nestled against a granite cliff. Smoke still wisped from the chimney. He'd been here recently, preparing. The cabin was sparse but clean. A single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table, and 2 chairs. Shelves held preserved food, ammunition, medical supplies, everything needed for survival. Nothing more. Nora swayed on her feet, exhaustion hitting like a physical blow. Jack guided her to the chair, movements careful not to touch more than necessary. He built up the fire, set coffee to brewing, then disappeared outside. When he returned, he carried her saddlebags, somehow rescued from her house before they fled. She looked at him in wonder, this silent guardian who'd thought of what she'd need. He set the bags by the bed and retreated to the far side of the room, giving her space. "I can't stay here," she said, though the words lacked conviction. "They'll find us." He shook his head, pointed to the window. She looked out and understood. The trail they'd climbed was already obscured by his careful work. Branches repositioned, tracks swept away. The plateau was invisible from below, accessible only to those who knew the secret ways. But for how long? She turned back to find him writing laboriously on a scrap of paper. Until safe, he'd written, month, maybe more. They watch roads. She sank into the chair, reality settling like lead in her stomach. A month in this cabin with this strange, silent man. Society would condemn her utterly if they knew. A widow alone with a man not her husband. Reputation shredded beyond repair. But what reputation remained to protect? They'd already decided her guilt, already moved to claim what was hers. At least here. She could breathe without the weight of their judgment. "Thank you," she said again, meaning it more deeply than before. He nodded and set about making breakfast, bacon, biscuits, the coffee strong enough to strip paint. They ate in companionable silence, and Nora found herself studying him openly. His hands were scarred but gentle with small tasks. His movements spoke of military training never forgotten. When he caught her watching, something almost like amusement flickered across his weathered features. As the sun climbed higher, exhaustion finally claimed her. Jack gestured to the bed, then pointed to himself and the door. He'd keep watch outside. The bed was narrow but comfortable, the quilts handmade with surprising skill. She lay down fully clothed, the derringer within reach, and fell into dreamless sleep. She woke to find afternoon shadows stretching across the floor and Jack sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. He'd placed a basin of water and a clean towel on the chair beside the bed. Such thoughtfulness from a man who spoke no words. Over the following days, they developed a routine born of necessity and mutual respect. Jack hunted and scouted, ensuring their safety. Nora took over the domestic chores, finding unexpected satisfaction in simple tasks after years of enforced idleness. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, and she found herself talking about books she'd read, places she'd dreamed of seeing, anything but the life she'd left behind. Jack listened with complete attention, occasionally writing questions that showed he'd absorbed every word. "Were you really in the war?" she asked one night. His face went very still. Then he nodded once. "Is that where—" She gestured to her throat. Another nod, but he held up his hand before she could voice sympathy. "On paper," he wrote. "Saved my life. Words would have got me killed." She understood then. A man who couldn't cry out, couldn't surrender, forced to survive by action alone. The war had taken his voice, but given him something else. A terrible clarity about what mattered and what didn't. On the 10th night, she woke to find him sitting by the window, rifle across his knees. Moonlight silvered his profile, and she saw the exhaustion he'd been hiding. "You need rest," she said softly. He shook his head, pointed outside. She joined him at the window but saw nothing except stars and swaying pines. "They're not coming tonight," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Please, sleep. I'll watch." The look he gave her was unreadable. Trust came hard to men like him, she realized. But finally, he nodded. He showed her the rifle's workings, made sure she understood. Then stretched out on the floor by the fire, refusing the bed, she sat in his chair, the rifle strange and heavy in her hands, and kept vigil over his sleep. He looked younger in repose, the harsh lines softening, and she wondered who he'd been before violence carved those marks into his soul. Near dawn, she heard horses on the trail below. Her heart hammered as she touched Jack's shoulder. He came awake instantly, silently, already reaching for his weapon. Together, they watched Benjamin cross and 3 riders search the canyon's entrance, frustrated by the false trails Jack had laid. The witch has to be somewhere. Cross's voice carried clearly. "Double the reward. I want her found." They waited, barely breathing, until the riders moved on. Jack's hand briefly covered hers where it gripped the rifle, a wordless reassurance. The touch burned through her like lightning, and she saw her own shock reflected in his eyes before he pulled away. That night, everything changed. The sunset painted the mountains blood and gold, and Nora stood outside the cabin, letting the wind tangle her hair. Freedom, even temporary. Tasted sweet as spring water. Jack emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one, then stood beside her, watching the light fade. The silence between them had shifted from awkward to comfortable to something else entirely, charged with possibility. "I was dead in that house," she said suddenly. "Long before Samuel died, just going through the motions, day after day, until I forgot I'd ever been alive." He set down his cup and wrote carefully, "You're alive now." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I am." Their eyes met and held. The world narrowed to that shared gaze, to the space between them that suddenly seemed both too much and not enough. Jack reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat, and touched a strand of her hair that had blown across her face. The touch was feather-light, reverent, but it ignited something wild in her chest. She caught his hand, pressing it to her cheek, and felt him tremble. "Nora," he said, and her name was barely a whisper, forced through damaged vocal cords by sheer will. The first word she'd heard him speak, and it sounded like a prayer. The days that followed took on a rhythm as natural as breathing. Jack would leave before dawn to check his trap lines and hunt, returning with rabbit or deer, sometimes wild turkey. Nora learned to skin and clean game, her hands growing calloused but capable. In the afternoons, while she prepared their meals, he would repair the cabin, patching chinks in the walls, reinforcing the door, making their shelter stronger against the coming winter. They worked in companionable silence, but the awareness between them hummed like a telegraph wire. When their hands accidentally touched passing a tool or plate, both would freeze for a heartbeat before continuing. Jack had returned to his wordless state after that single utterance of her name, but his eyes spoke volumes when they rested on her. One morning, Nora woke to find fresh wildflowers on the table, Indian paintbrush and mountain columbine arranged in a tin cup. Such a simple gesture, yet it made her throat tight with emotion. When Jack returned from his morning scout, she was wearing one of the red blooms in her hair. He stopped in the doorway, struck still by the sight of her. Slowly, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. Nora felt her own lips curve in response, and for a moment they simply stood there, grinning at each other like children. That evening, rain began to fall, growing from a gentle patter to a torrential downpour. They hurried to bring in firewood, getting thoroughly soaked in the process. Inside, Nora shivered in her wet dress, and Jack gestured for her to stand by the fire while he fetched a blanket. "I need to change," she said, teeth chattering. "Turn around." He immediately faced the wall, and she quickly stripped off the sodden dress, wrapping herself in the blanket he'd left on the chair. When she gave permission to turn back, she found him equally drenched, water running from his dark hair down his neck. "You'll catch your death," she said. "There's another blanket in the chest." He hesitated, then nodded. Now it was her turn to face away while he changed. The rustle of wet fabric, the soft sounds of movement. She was acutely aware of every noise when he cleared his throat softly. She turned to find him wrapped in a blanket, his clothes spread before the fire alongside hers. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire crackling between them. The rain had become a deluge, hammering the roof and turning the windows into sheets of silver. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and lightning illuminated the cabin in brief, stark moments. "I used to be terrified of storms," Nora admitted. "Samuel would mock me for it, said I was weak." Jack's face darkened. He reached for his paper and pencil, writing, "He was wrong about many things," she agreed softly. He wrote again, more slowly. "You're the strongest woman I've known." "How can you say that? You barely know me." His gray eyes held hers steadily as he wrote. "Saw you at funeral. No tears. Saw you face those men. No fear. See you here, learning new life. Strong." Nora felt tears prick her eyes, the ones she hadn't shed at Samuel's grave. "I was terrified," she confessed. "Every day of my marriage. Terrified of his moods, his temper, his demands." The words tumbled out. Secrets she'd never spoken. "When Doc Cartwright told us I couldn't have children, Samuel was furious. Called me useless, broken. Said I'd trapped him with damaged goods." Jack's knuckles went white where he gripped the pencil. He started to write something, crossed it out violently, then simply held out his hand across the space between them. She took it, feeling the calluses and scars, the contained strength. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, and she shivered with something that had nothing to do with cold. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. "In the war." His hand tightened briefly on hers. Then he released it to write. The story came in fragments, painful scratches of lead on paper. "Cavalry scout, sent ahead to check bridge. Ambush waiting. Whole unit died. Bullet through throat. Played dead in the bodies of friends." He paused, staring at the paper, then continued. "Couldn't call for help. Couldn't scream. Crawled away at night. Took months to heal. Months more to find the men who did it." "You found them?" she breathed. A single nod. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. Some justice was too dark for words. The storm raged on, sealing them in their small world of firelight and shadow. Nora found herself moving closer, drawn by warmth and something more. Jack watched her approach with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I dream about it sometimes," he wrote. "Their faces, the weight of bodies, the taste of blood. I dream about Samuel," she admitted, "standing over my bed, telling me all the ways I'm worthless. He's gone," Jack wrote firmly. "Can't hurt you now. Neither can your ghosts," she said softly. They sat in silence, shoulders almost touching, watching the fire die to embers. When Jack rose to add more wood, his blanket slipped, revealing the scars that mapped his torso. Bullet wounds, knife marks, the violent calligraphy of survival. Nora reached out without thinking, her fingers tracing a particularly vicious scar across his ribs. He went absolutely still, not even breathing. She jerked her hand back, face flaming. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have..." He caught her hand, pressing it back against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, rapid and strong. His eyes asked a question she wasn't sure she could answer. The storm chose that moment to send lightning crashing nearby, the thunder immediate and deafening. Nora involuntarily pressed closer, and suddenly she was in his arms, her face against his neck, feeling safe for the first time in memory. They stayed that way as the storm passed, neither willing to break the spell. Finally, exhaustion won. Jack carefully laid out bedrolls by the fire, 2 separate spaces, but close enough to touch if either reached out. Nora lay wakeful, hyper-aware of his breathing, the occasional shift of his body. When she finally slept, her dreams were not of Samuel, but of gray eyes and gentle hands. She woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee. Jack was already up, fully dressed, normalcy restored except for the way his gaze lingered on her face. After breakfast, he gestured to the rifle. "Time you learned properly," he wrote. They spent the morning with the Winchester, Jack patiently correcting her stance, her grip, her breathing. He stood behind her, arms bracketing hers to adjust her aim, and she forgot everything except the warmth of him, the way his breath stirred her hair. When she finally hit the target dead center, she spun in triumph to find him smiling that rare, transformative smile. Without thinking, she threw her arms around his neck. He caught her, lifting her off her feet in a brief, exuberant embrace before setting her down and stepping back, both of them breathless. That night, as they cleaned the rifle together, their fingers brushed reaching for the oil. This time, neither pulled away. Jack turned her hand palm up, tracing the new calluses with one finger. She watched, mesmerized, as he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her palm in a kiss so gentle it was barely there. "Jack," she whispered. He met her eyes, his own full of question and hunger in equal measure, slowly, giving her every chance to retreat. He cupped her face in his scarred hands. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed. The kiss was inevitable as sunrise, soft at first, almost hesitant, then deeper as she responded. His lips were chapped from wind and sun, but infinitely careful. When they parted, both were trembling. "I'm no good for you," he wrote shakily. "Broken, dangerous." "We're all broken," she said. "Maybe that's why we fit." He made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and pulled her against him. She could feel the war between desire and honor in the tension of his body, the careful way he held her. "I won't dishonor you," he wrote when they finally separated. "There's no dishonor in this," she said firmly. "Only in staying where we're not wanted, living lives that aren't ours." Days passed in growing intimacy. They didn't kiss again, but the awareness was constant, in shared glances, in the brush of hands, in the way they orbited each other like binary stars. Jack began teaching her other skills, how to read trail signs, find water, navigate by stars. Nora shared stories of books she'd read, places she'd dreamed of seeing. The person she'd been before marriage dimmed her light. One evening, as she brushed and braided her hair for sleep, she noticed Jack watching with an expression of such longing it took her breath. Without speaking, she moved to sit before him, offering the brush. His hands shook slightly as he took it. He worked through her hair with infinite patience, his touch reverent. When he began to braid, his fingers clumsy but determined. She closed her eyes against the intimacy of it. This simple act felt more profound than any words. When he finished, securing the braid with a strip of leather, she turned to face him. The space between them crackled with tension. She saw the moment his control broke, his eyes darkening, his breath catching. "Please," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for, but knowing she'd die without it. This time, when he kissed her, there was nothing hesitant about it. Years of loneliness and hunger poured into that connection. She matched his passion, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. When his lips found her throat, she gasped, arching against him. "Nora," he said against her skin, her name rough but clear. "My Nora." "Yes," she breathed. "Yours." He pulled back to look at her, and she saw her own wonder reflected in his face. Slowly, deliberately, she stood and held out her hand. He took it, rising, and let her lead him the few steps to the narrow bed. "Are you certain?" he asked, forcing the words through his damaged throat. "I've never been more certain of anything," she said. What followed was a revelation. Every touch was a conversation, every kiss a promise. Jack worshipped her with a passion tempered by tenderness, showing her pleasures Samuel had never imagined existed. She responded with equal fervor, glorying in the freedom to want, to take, to give without shame or fear. Later, they lay entwined in the narrow bed, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. His fingers combed through her unbound hair, and she pressed kisses to the scars within reach. "What happens now?" she asked softly. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, painfully, "Keep you safe, always." "That's not what I meant." "I know." His arms tightened around her, Can't go back, either of us. I don't want to go back, she said fiercely. Not to that life, not to being that woman. He tilted her face up, studying her in the moonlight. Whatever he saw made him kiss her again, deep and possessive. When they broke apart, he whispered, "Stay. With me. Always." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. They made love again as dawn approached, slower this time, memorizing each other with hands and lips. The rising sun painted their skin gold and rose, and Nora thought she'd never seen anything as beautiful as Jack's face soft with completion. Afterward, they rose and dressed, moving around each other with new familiarity. At breakfast, Jack reached across the table to take her hand, thumb rubbing circles on her wrist. Such a simple gesture, yet it spoke of possession, protection, partnership. They both knew the world beyond their hidden plateau would condemn them. A widow taking comfort with a damaged soldier, living in sin without benefit of clergy or law. But here, in their private Eden, such concerns seemed as distant as the stars. When Jack left to check his trap lines, he kissed her goodbye, a casual intimacy that made her heart soar. She watched him go, then turned to her daily tasks with a smile that wouldn't fade. For the first time since she was 17, Nora Whitlow felt truly alive. The morning was crisp with the promise of early winter when the rider appeared on the trail below. Jack spotted him first, his body tensing like a wolf scenting danger. He whistled low, their agreed signal, and Nora quickly doused the cook fire, grabbed the rifle, and took position by the window. But as the rider climbed closer, Jack's posture shifted from alarm to wary recognition. The man was grizzled and lean, wearing buckskins gone gray with age and weather. When he reached the hidden turn to their plateau, he stopped and called out, "Jack Renner, I know you're up there. You suspicious bastard. It's Elias. Come out before I freeze my bones waiting." Jack emerged from cover, weapon lowered but ready. The two men regarded each other with a careful assessment of predators recognizing their own kind. Then Elias Parker grinned, showing gaps where teeth used to be. "Been a while. Sergeant, heard you'd taken to these mountains. Also heard you might have... company." Jack's expression hardened, but Elias raised his hands peacefully. "Easy now. I'm not here for bounty money. Got something you need to hear." After a long moment, Jack nodded and led him up the hidden path. Nora waited inside, Derringer close at hand, until both men entered. Elias swept off his hat, giving her a courtly nod. "Ma'am, Elias Parker, served with Jack in the war, trapped these mountains for 20 years since." His keen eyes took in the domestic scene, 2 cups on the table, her sewing basket by the chair, the general air of shared living. "Seems congratulations are in order. Mr. Parker." Nora kept her voice neutral. "What brings you here?" "Bad news, I'm afraid." Elias accepted the coffee Jack offered, warming his hands on the tin cup. "That snake cross has been busy. He's got the territorial marshal involved now. Claims you killed your husband and robbed the bank." Nora's cup clattered to the table. "What?" "Forged evidence. From what I hear, witnesses who'll swear they saw you arguing with your husband the night he died. Missing gold from the bank vault. Real thorough job." Elias's weathered face was grim. "They've raised the bounty to $500, dead or alive." Jack's hand found Nora's shoulder, steadying her. She covered it with her own, drawing strength from his presence. "There's more," Elias continued. "Cross has been spreading other stories. Says the widow Whitlow has been corrupted by the murderer Jack Renner, that she's gone wild, needs to be brought back for her own good." He spat into the fire. "Man's got a tongue like a rattler and twice as poisonous." "What does he want?" Nora asked. Though she suspected she knew. "Same thing he's always wanted. Your late husband's holdings. With you dead or locked away. Everything defaults to the bank. He's already drawn up papers, just waiting for your death certificate to file them." Jack wrote quickly. "How long before they find us?" Elias considered. "Week, maybe 2. I've been laying false trails, But there's only so much misdirection possible. Eventually, someone will remember this place from the old mining days. They sat in heavy silence, the weight of the outside world crashing into their mountain sanctuary. Finally, Nora spoke. We could run, head north to Canada, or west to California. Could. Elias agreed. But winter's coming fast. Passes will be snow-locked within the month, and Cross has sent word ahead. Every town for 300 miles has your description. Then we fight, she said. Both men looked at her in surprise. She stood, pacing to the window, looking out at the peaks that had sheltered them. I'm tired of running, tired of being painted as the villain in someone else's story. She turned back to them, chin raised. I have evidence too. Samuel kept records of his less legitimate dealings, hidden, but I know where, if we could get to them. Suicide, Elias said flatly. Towns wrapped up tighter than a drum. You'd be shot on sight. Jack was writing furiously. He showed the paper to Elias first, whose eyebrows rose, then to Nora, who read it twice before responding. You want to what? Jack wrote again. Make them come to us. Our ground. Our terms. The plan that emerged over the next hours was audacious in its simplicity. Elias would return to town with a message. Nora would surrender, but only at a neutral location, with guarantees of safe passage to trial. While Cross and his men were distracted, Jack would slip into town for the evidence. It's too dangerous, Nora protested. If they catch you, Jack cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with such intensity she forgot to breathe. Then he wrote, worth any risk, for you. That night, with Elias bedded down by the fire, Nora and Jack lay close in their narrow bed, speaking in touches rather than words. She pressed her face into his neck, breathing him in, memorizing his warmth against the cold possibility of loss. I can't lose you, she whispered. Not when I've just found you. His arms tightened around her, and he spoke, forcing the words through his damaged throat. Never. Leave you. Promise. They made love with desperate tenderness, muffling their sounds in each other's skin, hands clutching as if they could hold back the dawn through will alone. Morning came anyway. Elias departed with the message, and the waiting began. Jack spent the time preparing, cleaning weapons, setting defensive positions, teaching Nora the signals they'd use. She forced herself to focus on practical matters, preserving meat, organizing medical supplies, anything to keep her mind from the danger ahead. 3 days later, Elias returned with Cross's response. The banker had agreed to the meeting, noon, 5 days hence, at Widow's Creek Crossing. He would bring the marshal and 5 men. Nora could have 1 companion. He's confident, Elias observed. Too confident. Watch for treachery. The night before the meeting, a storm rolled in, bringing early snow to dust the peaks white. Jack and Nora sat by the fire, maps spread between them as they finalized every detail. He would leave at midnight, circle wide through the mountains, enter town from the east while everyone watched the western road. The evidence is in Samuel's private safe, Nora explained again. Behind the portrait of his father in the study, the combination is his mother's birthday, March 15th, 36. Jack nodded, committing it to memory. Then he set aside the maps and pulled her into his lap, holding her close. They stayed that way as the hours ticked past, speaking in whispers and long silences. At midnight, he rose and dressed for travel. Dark clothes, light pack, weapons secured. Nora helped with the buckles, her hands steady despite her racing heart. At the door, he turned back, pulling her against him for a kiss that tasted of promises and fear. Come back to me, she commanded. He nodded, touched her face once more, and melted into the snowy darkness. The next day crawled past. Nora cleaned the already spotless cabin, checked and rechecked the rifle, started a dozen tasks without finishing any, when Elias arrived to escort her to the meeting. She was dressed in her gray traveling suit, proper widow's attire that nonetheless allowed for movement. You sure about this? The old trapper asked. No, she admitted, but I'm going anyway. They rode in silence through a landscape transformed by snow, The familiar trails looked alien and white, beautiful and treacherous. At Widow's Creek, Cross waited with his promised contingent, their horses stamping in the cold. Mrs. Whitlow. Cross touched his hat mockingly. So good of you to see reason at last. Mr. Cross. She kept her voice level despite her disgust. I've come to hear your terms. Simple enough. Sign these papers transferring all holdings to the bank, and we'll see you safely to the territorial capital for trial. I'm sure a jury will be understanding about a woman driven to desperate acts. She dismounted, approaching slowly. Marshal Harland watched with professional interest, hand near his weapon. The other men spread out, cutting off escape routes. And if I refuse? Cross's smile was cold as the snow beginning to fall. Then I'm afraid we'll have to consider you a fugitive resisting arrest. Such situations can turn unfortunate. Nora made a show of considering, buying time. Where was Jack? Had he made it to town? Was he even now rifling through Samuel's safe? Or lying somewhere with a bullet in his back? I need guarantees, she said. Written promises of safe passage, fair trial. You need nothing but the sense to accept mercy when it's offered. Cross's patience frayed. Sign the papers. Widow, now. The distant crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley. Then another. All heads turned toward town, where smoke was beginning to rise. What the hell? Marshal Harland began. Elias chuckled. Sounds like someone's having a disagreement back in Dustwater. Cross's face went purple. You planned this. Seize her! But Nora was already moving, diving for her horse as Elias covered her retreat. The old trapper was still deadly with a Winchester, forcing Cross's men to seek cover. Nora gained her saddle and spurred hard for the tree line. After her! Cross screamed. Don't let her escape! The chase was brutal. Horses struggling through deepening snow, branches whipping past. Nora rode as Jack had taught her, low over the mare's neck, trusting the animal's instincts. Behind her, shouts and gunfire split the winter air. A rider closed from the left, one of Cross's men, younger and better mounted. He reached for her reins, and she drew the derringer. Firing point blank, he tumbled from his saddle with a scream, and she rode on without looking back. The hidden trail to the plateau appeared like salvation. She took it at dangerous speed, hooves skidding on icy stone. At the top, she leaped from the saddle and ran for the cabin, praying Jack had made it back. The door burst open before she reached it, and he was there, alive, whole, pulling her inside. His clothes smelled of smoke and gunpowder, but his arms were solid and real around her. Did you? She began. He nodded, pointing to a leather satchel on the table. Samuel's records, retrieved at terrible cost. Through the window, she could see riders milling at the plateau's base, unwilling to attempt the treacherous path in the snow. They'll wait us out, she said. Jack shook his head, already moving. He'd prepared for this, supplies packed, escape route planned. Within minutes, they were ready. But instead of heading for the back trail, Jack led her to the root cellar. Inside, hidden beneath stacked preserves, was a tunnel, an old mining shaft he'd spent weeks clearing. It led through the mountain, emerging a mile away in a box canyon where 2 horses waited, provisioned for hard travel. As they prepared to enter the tunnel, a voice echoed up from below. Cross, made bold by rage. You can't run forever, widow. I'll see you hang if it takes my last breath. Jack paused at the cellar entrance. Considering, then, deliberately, he stepped out where Cross could see him. When he spoke, his damaged voice carried clearly in the cold air. She's under my protection. Come for her. You come through me. It was the most he'd spoken since the war. Each word fought for and won. Nora's eyes burned with tears as he came back to her, taking her hand. Together, they entered the darkness of the tunnel, leaving Dustwater and all its poisonous judgments behind. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, a life outside society's boundaries. But they would face it together, and that was enough. The lantern light flickered on rough stone walls as they made their way through the mountain's heart. Behind them, The shouts faded, swallowed by earth and stone. Ahead, somewhere beyond the darkness, freedom waited. Jack squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. A wordless promise, a silent vow. Whatever came next, they would meet it as they'd learned to meet everything, together, unflinching, alive. The tunnel emerged into bitter cold and swirling snow. Jack helped Nora mount the waiting horse, then swung up onto his own. They rode hard through the night, pushing the animals as much as they dared, following trails only Jack could see in the white blind landscape. By dawn, they'd put 20 miles between themselves and Dustwater. They sheltered in a shallow cave, sharing body heat and cold biscuits while the horses rested. Nora studied the documents they'd risked everything to retrieve. Samuel's private ledgers revealing a web of corruption involving not just Cross, but the territorial judge, several lawmakers, and a land company based in Denver. "This is bigger than we thought," she said, showing Jack entries detailing bribes, forged deeds, and suspicious deaths. Samuel wasn't just corrupt, he was murdered because he knew too much. Jack read quickly, his face darkening. He wrote, "Names here I recognize, dangerous men. Then we need help, legal help, from someone beyond their reach." Nora thought carefully. "There's a federal marshal in Denver, William Brackett. My father knew him years ago. He has a reputation for honesty." The journey to Denver took a week of hard travel, dodging both the weather and pursuit. Twice they had to hide as riders passed, Cross's men ranging far in their search. By the time they reached the city's outskirts, both were exhausted, windburned, pushed to their limits. Denver sprawled before them, a booming metropolis compared to Dustwater, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. They found lodging in a boarding house on the poor side of town, registering as Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, newly arrived from Kansas. The landlady, Mrs. O'Brien, took one look at their worn clothes and Jack's scarred face and asked no questions beyond whether they could pay a week in advance. That night, in a room barely larger than the cabins, they lay together on a bed that creaked with every movement. The city sounds, horses, wagons, drunken shouts, life in all its messy glory, seemed overwhelming after their mountain solitude. "I'll go to the marshal's office tomorrow," Nora said. Jack shook his head firmly. "Riding, together, not letting you face this alone. They might recognize you." He touched her lips, silencing her objection, then wrote, "Don't care, together." The next morning, cleaned up as best they could manage, they walked through Denver's busy streets to the federal building. Marshal William Brackett was a tall man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He listened to their story in silence, occasionally asking pointed questions, examining the documents with increasing interest. "This is substantial," he finally said. "If even half of this is provable, we're looking at conspiracy, murder, fraud on a massive scale." He leaned back, studying them. "You realize what you're asking. These men have power, influence, money. Going after them will be like kicking a hornet's nest." "They've already destroyed our lives," Nora said quietly. "We have nothing left to lose, and everything to gain." Brackett mused. "Very well. I'll need sworn statements from both of you, and we'll need to verify these ledger entries. It will take time." "How much time?" Jack forced out. Brackett's eyes widened slightly at the damaged voice, but he answered steadily. "Weeks, maybe months. Can you stay hidden that long?" They found work to sustain themselves while the investigation proceeded. Nora took in washing and mending, skills learned in their mountain refuge serving her well. Jack found employment at the stockyards. Brutal work. But his silence was an asset among men who valued actions over words. In the evenings, they returned to their small room, creating a different kind of sanctuary amid the urban chaos. The bed might creak, the walls might be thin, but in each other's arms they found the same peace they'd known on the plateau. One night, 3 weeks after their arrival, Jack came home with split knuckles and a black eye. Nora tended his wounds while he wrote an explanation. Man from Dustwater at Stockyards. Recognized me. Had to discourage him. Did you? Is he alive, but won't be talking? Jack caught her worried look and added, Just broken jaw. He'll heal. The next day brought troubling news from Marshal Brackett. Cross had hired Pinkerton detectives to track them, and rewards were posted as far east as St. Louis. Moreover, some of the corrupt officials named in Samuel's ledgers were moving to cover their tracks. We need more than documents, Brackett said. We need witnesses, someone who can testify to what they've seen. Elias, Nora said immediately. He knows where the bodies are buried, literally, in some cases. Jack wrote quickly. I'll go back for him. Absolutely not, Nora said. If you go, I go. They argued that night, their first real fight. Jack wanted her safe. She refused to let him face danger alone. Finally, exhausted and emotional, she pressed her face against his chest. Don't you understand? She whispered. You're all I have. If something happens to you, I might as well be dead. He held her tightly, pressing kisses to her hair, when he finally wrote his response. His hand shook slightly. Same for me. Can't lose you. Won't survive it. In the end, they compromised. Jack would go, but with 2 deputy marshals for backup. Nora would stay in Denver, protected by Brackett's men. The separation loomed like a physical wound. The night before Jack left, they made love with desperate passion. Every touch was memorized, every whispered endearment treasured against the lonely time ahead. When dawn came too soon, Nora helped him prepare, her movement steady despite her breaking heart. At the door, Jack turned back. With enormous effort, he spoke, Love you, my Nora, always. I love you too, she said through tears. Come back to me. The days that followed were agony. Nora threw herself into helping Brackett build the case, organizing evidence, writing detailed accounts of everything she'd witnessed, but at night, alone in their bed that smelled of him, she thought she might go mad with worry. A week passed, then 2. No word came, and even Brackett began to look concerned. Then, on a gray afternoon threatening snow, commotion erupted outside. Nora ran to the window to see a small convoy arriving. The deputies, Elias and Jack. The latter slumped in his saddle, blood staining his coat. She flew down the stairs, reaching him as the deputies helped him dismount. He was conscious, but pale, a bullet wound in his shoulder seeping red. Ambush, one deputy explained as they carried Jack inside. Cross's men were waiting. We got through, but it was close. The next hours blurred together, a doctor summoned. The wound cleaned and dressed, laudanum forced between Jack's lips for the pain. Nora never left his side, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Elias, weathered but intact, sat with her during the long vigil. He's tough, the old trapper said. Seen him survive worse. What happened? Cross is getting desperate. He's lost support in Dustwater. Too many questions about Samuel's death. About the missing money. When he heard we were coming for witnesses, he set up an ambush at Eagle Pass. Jack spotted it in time, but took a bullet warning us. Elias smiled grimly. Cross lost 4 men learning not to corner a wounded wolf. Jack woke fully the next morning, gray eyes finding Nora's immediately. She pressed kisses to his face, not caring who saw. Don't ever do that again, she commanded through tears. He managed a weak smile, then wrote with his good hand, Worth it. God, Elias got evidence. Indeed, Elias had brought more than just testimony. Hidden in his packs were documents from other victims of Cross's schemes, families driven off their land, minors cheated of claims, even a widow forced into an asylum so her property could be seized. Enough to hang them all, Brackett said with satisfaction. Once your man heals, we move. Jack recovered with frustrating slowness, chafing at the enforced inactivity. Nora tended him with a mix of tenderness and sternness, refusing to let him push too hard. During those quiet days, they talked, or rather, she talked and he wrote responses, sharing dreams and fears, planning a future neither had dared imagine before. "When this is over," she said one evening, "where shall we go?" Jack considered, then wrote, "Anywhere, everywhere, as long as together." "California," she suggested. "I've always wanted to see the ocean." He nodded, then added, "Small town, quiet, where no one knows our past. Where you can heal," she said softly, touching his throat. "Maybe even find your voice again." He caught her hand, kissing her palm, then wrote, "Already found it. When I say your name." 2 weeks later, Jack insisted he was ready. The plan was simple. Arrests would be made simultaneously in Denver and Dustwater, catching the conspirators before they could flee or destroy evidence. Jack would testify through written statements and Elias's interpretation. Nora would take the stand herself, a prospect that terrified and exhilarated her. The night before the operation, they lay together carefully, mindful of Jack's healing shoulder. The boarding house bed had never seemed more precious, this small space that had sheltered their love through danger and uncertainty. "Are you frightened?" Nora asked. Jack nodded, then wrote, "Not of them, of losing this, losing you." "Never," she promised. "We've come too far to lose now." They made love gently, a reaffirmation of life and hope in the darkness afterward. Nora traced the new scar on his shoulder, adding it to her mental map of his body, all the places where violence had marked but not broken him. "After tomorrow," she whispered. "No more running, no more hiding." He pulled her close with his good arm, and she felt him nod against her hair. Tomorrow would bring justice or disaster. But tonight they had this, each other, love proven by trial, a future waiting to be claimed. Through their small window, snow began to fall, blanketing Denver in pristine white. Somewhere out there, Cross waited unknowing, secure in his power. Marshal Brackett's men checked their weapons and prepared their warrants. The machinery of justice, slow but inexorable, ground toward morning. But in their room, Nora and Jack simply held each other. Two souls who'd found salvation in the wilderness, now ready to fight for their right to live free. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as they'd learned to face everything. Together, unflinching, bound by something stronger than law or propriety. Love. Simply. Purely. Defiantly. Love. The morning of reckoning dawned cold and clear. Marshal Brackett's men moved into position before first light, surrounding the Denver offices where several conspirators worked. In Dustwater, federal deputies prepared for simultaneous arrests. The plan was precise. Hit them all at once, before warning could spread. Nora and Jack waited at the federal building with Elias, ready to provide testimony once the arrests were made. Jack wore his best clothes, simple but clean, and had shaved carefully around his healing shoulder. Still, tension radiated from him like heat from a stove. "It'll work," Nora said quietly, straightening his collar. "It has to." He caught her hands, holding them against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, rapid but steady. The words he couldn't speak showed in his eyes. Love, fear, determination mixed in gray depths. The first word came at noon. Deputies had arrested Judge Hammond in his chambers, catching him in the act of burning documents. 2 territorial legislators were taken at their club, but the prime target, Benjamin Cross, was nowhere to be found. "He was warned," Brackett said grimly. "Someone leaked our plan." Before anyone could respond, gunfire erupted outside. Through the window, Nora saw armed riders storming the federal building, Cross's hired guns, making a desperate play. Deputies scrambled for defensive positions as bullets shattered windows. "Get them to the back rooms," Brackett shouted, drawing his weapon. But Jack was already moving, pushing Nora behind an overturned desk while reaching for a rifle from the wall rack. His injured shoulder didn't slow him as he took position by a window, the weapon steady in his hands. The battle was brief, but vicious. Cross's men, perhaps 20 strong, had expected surprise to carry the day. They hadn't counted on facing federal marshals and a former cavalry scout who'd learned warfare in harder schools than theirs. Jack fought with economical precision, each shot deliberate and devastating. Beside him, Elias worked a lever-action Winchester with deadly efficiency. Within minutes, the attackers were fleeing, leaving half their number dead or wounded in the street. "Anyone hurt?" Brackett called out. "Deputy Morrison took one in the leg." Someone answered, "Nothing fatal." Through the gun smoke, Nora saw movement. Benjamin Cross himself, using the chaos as cover to enter through a side door. He had a pistol in one hand and madness in his eyes. "Where is she?" he screamed. "Where's that murdering witch?" Jack turned, but Cross was already raising his weapon. Time slowed to crystalline clarity. Nora saw the barrel swing toward her, saw Jack moving but knowing he'd be too late, saw death coming with the inevitability of sunrise. The shot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, but it wasn't Cross's gun that fired. Nora stood with Samuel's Derringer smoking in her hand, the small weapon she'd carried since leaving Dustwater finally serving its purpose. Cross looked down at the spreading red stain on his vest, surprise replacing rage on his face. "You," he gasped, falling to his knees. "Yes," Nora said steadily. "Me." Cross pitched forward and moved no more. The Derringer clattered from Nora's suddenly nerveless fingers as the reality of what she'd done crashed over her. Then Jack's arms were around her, turning her away from the body, pressing her face against his chest. "Had to," he forced out, the words rough with emotion. "No choice." "I know," she whispered. "I know." The aftermath was a blur of statements, investigations, paperwork. Cross's death was ruled justified, self-defense in the clearest terms. More importantly, documents found on his body provided the final evidence needed to unravel the conspiracy completely. The trials that followed were sensations, reported in newspapers from Denver to Washington. Nora testified with clear voice and steady hands, detailing the corruption that had festered in Dustwater. When prosecutors tried to paint her as a fallen woman, living in sin with a killer, she faced them without flinching. "Yes, I lived with Jack Renner without benefit of marriage," she stated. "He saved my life when those sworn to uphold the law would have destroyed it. If that makes me fallen, then I embrace the fall." The gallery erupted, some in condemnation, others in support. Through it all, Jack sat in the witness section, his presence a silent pillar of strength. When his turn came, Elias translated his written testimony, the old trapper's voice carrying Jack's words with surprising eloquence. One by one, the conspirators fell. Judge Hammond, 20 years hard labor. The legislators, stripped of office and imprisoned. The land company officials fled to Mexico steps ahead of arrest warrants. By spring, the network that had terrorized Dustwater was shattered. On a warm April morning, Nora and Jack returned to the town one last time. The place seemed smaller than memory, diminished without the weight of fear. They went first to the cemetery, standing before Samuel's grave in silence. Nora had thought she might feel something, satisfaction, perhaps, or lingering anger. Instead, there was only emptiness, the past as dead as the man beneath the stone. At the bank, now under federal management, they signed the papers returning Nora's property to her full control. The house on Maple Street stood empty, dust thick on the furniture, ghosts in every room. "Burn it," Nora said suddenly. "All of it." Jack looked at her questioningly. "I don't want it," she continued. "Not the house? Not the money from its sale? None of it. Let the town have it for a school or hospital. Something good from all that pain." They spent one night at the boarding house where their flight had begun. Mrs. Patterson, the proprietress, could barely contain her curiosity about the notorious widow and her silent companion. But Nora had learned the power of silence from Jack. They gave her nothing but polite distance. That evening, they climbed to the plateau one final time. The cabin stood as they'd left it, door still bearing the scars of their escape. Inside, everything waited. The narrow bed where they'd first made love, the table where they'd shared meals, the hearth where they'd found warmth against winter's bite. "We could stay," Nora said softly. "Make this our home." Jack shook his head slowly, then wrote, Too small now. Need bigger sky. She understood. They'd grown beyond this refuge. Wonderful as it had been. It was time for new horizons. They gathered a few mementos, the quilt from the bed, Jack's carving knife, the tin cup that had held wildflowers. As the sun set, they stood together on the ledge, looking out over the valley. "Thank you," Nora said, "for all of it, for saving me." Jack turned her to face him, touching her cheek with infinite gentleness. Then, with great effort, he spoke. "You saved me, too." They rode out at dawn, pack horses laden with supplies for the long journey west. California waited. Golden beaches, new cities, places where their past was truly past. At the town limits, they paused for one last look at Dustwater. "No regrets," Jack wrote on his ever-present paper. "None," Nora said firmly. "Not one." They were 3 days into the journey when they came upon a small town called Haven Springs. It had a white church with a bell tower, a general store with friendly proprietors, children playing in dust-free streets. Something about it spoke of peace, of possibility. "Wait," Nora said suddenly. Let's just see." They took rooms at the local inn, intending to stay just one night, but morning found them lingering over breakfast, talking with locals who asked no prying questions. The town needed a schoolteacher, the mayor mentioned, and there was always work for a man good with horses and his hands. Jack and Nora looked at each other across the table, a whole conversation in that glance. "We're actually bound for California," Nora began. "Shame," the mayor's wife said. "You seem like the kind of folks who'd fit right in here. We don't much care where people come from, long as they're good neighbors going forward." That afternoon, they walked the town properly. There was a small house for sale on the outskirts. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen garden, a barn suitable for horses. Mountains rose in the distance, but gentle ones. Nothing like the fierce peaks that had sheltered them. "What do you think?" Nora asked. Jack studied the house, the town, the sky. Then he wrote, "Feels like home." The wedding was small, held in the church on a Sunday afternoon. Elias came down from the mountains to stand as Jack's witness. The innkeeper's wife stood for Nora. When the Reverend asked for objections, the silence was profound and perfect. "Do you, Jack, take this woman?" "Yes," Jack managed, the word clear as mountain water. "Do you, Nora, take this man?" "With all my heart," she answered. They signed the register as Mr. and Mrs. Jack Renner, legal at last in the eyes of God and man. But they'd been married in truth since that night in the cabin, bound by something stronger than any earthly law. The house on Oak Street became their haven. Jack found work at the livery stable and later started his own horse training business. His silence, once a burden, became an asset. Horses trusted him instinctively, sensing his gentle nature beneath the scarred exterior. Nora did take the teaching position, finding unexpected joy in young minds eager to learn. Her students didn't care that their teacher had a past. They cared that she made letters come alive, that she taught them to dream beyond Haven Springs while appreciating what they had. In the evenings, they sat on their porch, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Jack's voice grew stronger with use and peace, though he'd never be garrulous. He saved his words for what mattered. "Love you," when they woke. "Beautiful," when she wore her hair down. "Home," when they returned from any time apart. One evening, as summer fireflies danced in their garden, Nora felt a flutter in her belly that had nothing to do with their supper. She caught Jack's hand, placing it on her stomach, watching his eyes widen with understanding. "The doctor said it wasn't possible," she whispered. Jack fell to his knees, pressing his face against her middle, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When he looked up, tears streaming down his weathered face, he managed one word: "Miracle." And perhaps it was. Perhaps love could heal what cruelty had broken. Perhaps second chances came to those brave enough to seize them. Perhaps 2 damaged souls could create something whole and perfect between them. As the stars emerged over Haven Springs, Nora and Jack Renner held each other on their porch, no longer running, no longer hiding. They'd found their place in the world, not the one society had assigned them, but the one they'd carved out with courage and devotion. The past was done. The future spread before them, bright with promise. And in that moment, on that porch, with the new life growing between them, they were complete. The winter of 1884 came early to Haven Springs, blanketing the town in pristine white. Nora, heavy with child, moved carefully through their small house, one hand supporting her back. Jack watched her with the vigilance of a man who'd learned how quickly joy could turn to sorrow. "I'm fine," she assured him for the 10th time that morning. "Women have been doing this since Eve," he wrote on his slate. He kept one in every room now. Eve didn't have bullet scars. It was true. The physical remnants of their ordeal had faded but not vanished. Sometimes, on cold nights. Jack's shoulder ached where Cross's bullet had torn through. Nora still started at unexpected gunshots. But here in Haven Springs, such reminders came rarely. Dr. Marcus Winthrop had become a regular visitor as Nora's time approached. Unlike the harsh physicians of Dustwater, he was gentle and encouraging. "Everything looks perfect," he announced after his examination. "The baby's positioned well. You're healthy. Whatever that fool in Dustwater told you about being barren, he was wrong." "Or maybe," Nora said, catching Jack's eye, "I just needed the right man." Jack colored slightly but squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, their private language of love. On a crystalline December night, Nora woke to a warm rush of fluid and the first clenching pain. Jack was alert instantly, a lifetime of danger having trained him to wake fully at the slightest change. "It's time," she gasped. He was already moving, stoking the fire, heating water, everything they'd prepared for. His hands were steady, but she saw the fear in his eyes. This was one battle he couldn't fight for her, Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, the midwife, arrived with a doctor just as the pains grew regular. Adelaide was a sturdy woman who'd delivered half the babies in town, and her presence brought calm to the room. "Men outside," she ordered briskly. "This is women's work now." Jack looked rebellious, but Nora nodded. "I'll be fine. Go." He kissed her forehead, then forced out, "Be here, waiting." The hours that followed blurred into a haze of pain and effort. Nora gripped Adelaide's hands, pushing when told, resting between contractions. Through the window, she could see Jack pacing the porch despite the cold, Elias beside him offering silent companionship. "Nearly there," Adelaide encouraged. "You're doing beautifully." Dawn was breaking, painting the snow-covered mountains rose and gold, when the final push brought their child into the world. A healthy cry split the air, and Nora sobbed with relief. "A girl." "Doctor," Winthrop announced, cleaning the baby gently. "Perfect in every way." Adelaide placed the infant on Nora's chest, and the world narrowed to this tiny, miraculous being. Dark hair like Jack's, a stubborn chin that was purely Nora's, eyes that would surely be gray when they opened properly. "Let the father in," Nora whispered. "Please." Jack entered hesitantly, as if afraid his presence might shatter something precious. When he saw them, his wife and daughter together, whole and healthy, his knees buckled. He caught himself on the bedpost, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Come meet her," Nora said softly. He approached with reverent care, sinking onto the bed beside them. With one trembling finger, he touched the baby's impossibly small hand. She gripped it immediately, holding tight, and Jack made a sound between a laugh and a sob. "What shall we call her?" Nora asked. Jack thought, then wrote carefully, "Sarah Grace, for new beginnings. Sarah Grace Renner." Nora tested. "It's perfect." The town of Haven Springs embraced the new family without reservation. Gifts appeared on their doorstep, knitted blankets, preserved foods, toys carved by local hands. Jack's reputation as an honest man who worked hard and minded his business had earned respect. Nora's dedication to her students had earned affection. Sarah grew quickly. A happy baby who rarely cried, Jack was enchanted. spending hours simply watching her sleep. He crafted a cradle of pine and oak, carving delicate flowers along the sides. In the evenings, he'd hold her while Nora prepared supper, humming tunelessly, the closest he could come to lullabies. When Sarah was 3 months old, a letter arrived that threatened their peace. The return address was Dustwater, the handwriting unfamiliar. Nora's hands shook as she opened it. Mrs. Renner, it read. I am writing to inform you that questions have been raised about the legitimacy of your marriage and subsequent property transfers. Certain parties suggest your husband unduly influenced you while you were in a vulnerable state. If you would like to avoid renewed legal difficulties, I suggest we meet to discuss terms. Cordially, Theodore Ashford, attorney at law. Jack read it over her shoulder, his body tensing with each word. Before Nora could stop him, he'd crumpled the letter and thrown it into the fire. It's not over, she said quietly. They're still trying to take what's mine. Jack wrote fiercely. Let them try. Different now. He was right. They were no longer isolated, no longer without allies. When Nora showed the letter's remains to Marshal Brackett on his next visit, his face darkened. Ashford, he said with disgust. Cross's cousin. He's been trying to revive the old claims. Says the trials were tainted by your compromised testimony. No legal standing, but he's making noise. What should we do? Nothing, Brackett advised. You're legally married. Your property transfers are documented and witnessed. He's fishing, hoping you'll panic and pay him to go away. But Nora couldn't shake her unease. The past had taught her that determined men with grudges could do terrible damage. She found herself checking windows at night, starting when riders approached their home. Jack noticed, of course. He noticed everything about her. One evening, as Sarah slept peacefully in her cradle, he took Nora's hands. Safe, he said firmly. We're safe. I know, but... He placed a finger on her lips, then wrote, Different now. Have friends, have law, have this. He gestured around their home. The solid walls, the life they'd built, the community that had embraced them. Then he placed his hand over her heart. Have us, he managed. Family, stronger than their hate. She leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. You're right. I'm being foolish. Not foolish. Careful. Good. He kissed her temple. But don't let them steal today worrying about tomorrow. Spring arrived with a letter from an unexpected source. William Thornton, the young bank clerk who'd worked under Cross, wrote to apologize for his part in the conspiracy and to warn that Ashford was planning something. He didn't know what, but papers had been filed in the territorial capital. This time, instead of fear, Nora felt anger. How dare they continue to harass her family? She'd endured enough, lost enough, fought enough. It was time to end this permanently. I'm going to Dustwater, she announced. Jack's expression was thunderous. He wrote rapidly, Absolutely not. Too dangerous. Then come with me. Bring Sarah. Let them see what they're trying to destroy. A family, a real marriage. A life built on love, not greed. They argued for days. But Nora's determination won. With Brackett's support and a federal escort, they made the journey back to the town that had nearly destroyed them. Dustwater had changed. Without Cross's iron grip and corrupt money, it had withered. The bank building stood empty, windows broken. Many businesses had closed. The remaining citizens looked at the returning party with a mixture of curiosity and shame. The hearing was held in the courthouse, Judge Raymond Morse presiding, a fair man appointed after Hammond's removal. Ashford presented his case with oily skill, painting Nora as a manipulative woman who'd seduced a damaged veteran to steal her husband's fortune. When Nora's turn came, she stood with Sarah in her arms, Jack beside her. She spoke simply, truthfully, without dramatics. Yes, I fell in love with Jack Renner. Yes, we lived together before marriage, because corrupt men in this very room were trying to force me into servitude or death. Yes, I gave away most of my inheritance, because it was built on others' misery. She looked directly at Ashford. What you call manipulation, I call survival. What you call seduction, I call finding the first honest man I'd ever known. What you call theft, I call justice." Sarah chose that moment to wake, gurgling happily and reaching for Jack. He took her with practiced ease, and she immediately grabbed his nose, making him smile. The courtroom stirred at the sight, the supposedly dangerous killer, gentle as a lamb with his daughter. "Your Honor," Nora concluded, "I stand before you not as the banker's widow, but as Mrs. Jack Renner, teacher, mother, and citizen of Haven Springs. These men seek to drag us backward into their web of hate and greed. I ask you to cut those threads permanently and let us live in peace." The judge's decision was swift and scathing. Not only did he dismiss Ashford's claims, but he referred the lawyer to the bar for disciplinary action. Furthermore, he issued a permanent injunction preventing any further harassment of the Renner family. As they left the courthouse, some citizens approached hesitantly. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house pressed Nora's hand. "We were wrong about you," she said simply. "I'm sorry." Others echoed the sentiment, not everyone, but enough to show that Dustwater too was trying to heal from its poisoned past. They stayed one more night, at the same boarding house where their flight had begun. That evening, Jack took Nora and Sarah to the cemetery, at Samuel's grave. Nora felt nothing. The man below had no more power over her. "Forgive him?" Jack asked quietly, the words coming easier now with practice. "No," Nora said honestly. "But I don't carry him anymore either. He's truly dead to me now." They left at dawn, Dustwater shrinking behind them for the last time. The journey home was peaceful, Sarah charming their escorts with her ready smiles and babbling attempts at speech. Haven Springs welcomed them back with relief and quiet celebration. The story spread, how Nora had faced down her persecutors, how Jack had stood silent guard, how baby Sarah had won hearts simply by being herself. That night, as they lay in their own bed with Sarah sleeping nearby, Nora traced the scars on Jack's chest, old ones from the war, newer ones from protecting her. "We really are free now," she whispered. "Completely free." He nodded, then spoke carefully. "Free to live, free to love, free to be happy." "Are you happy?" His answer was in the kiss he pressed to her lips, in the way he held her close, in the tears that slipped silently down his cheeks. When he finally spoke, the words came clear despite his damaged voice. "Never thought I'd have this wife, child, home, worth, everything we suffered." Nora curled against him, listening to his heartbeat, feeling Sarah's presence like a warm blessing in the darkness. He was right. Every moment of pain, every fearful night, every desperate flight had led them here, to this home, this love, this life they'd built from the ashes of their former selves. Outside, Haven Springs slept peacefully under star-drunk skies. Inside, the Renner family rested together, no longer running, no longer afraid. They'd faced the worst the world could offer and emerged not unscarred, but unbroken. The past was finished. The future stretched ahead bright with promise. And in that moment, in that bed, in that home, they had everything they needed, each other, their daughter, and the quiet triumph of love over hate. 1 year later, the Elkhorn Mountains stood witness to a different kind of gathering, where once Nora and Jack had hidden from the world. Now families spread blankets for a picnic. Children ran laughing through wildflower meadows, and the sound of community filled the air. It had been Elias's idea, a reunion of sorts, bringing together those whose lives had intertwined during the dark days in Dustwater. Marshall Brackett came with his wife. The Morrisons brought their twin boys. Even young William Thornton made the journey from Denver, where he now worked as an honest accountant. Jack had built a pavilion near their old cabin, transforming the place of refuge into a site of celebration. He worked with quiet efficiency, his movements sure despite his still-healing body. The bullet wound from the courthouse battle had left its mark, but like all his scars, he wore it as proof of survival rather than shame. Sarah, now walking on unsteady legs, toddled between the adults with the confidence of a child who'd never known anything but love. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined spirit, a combination that promised interesting times ahead. "She'll be a handful," Adelaide Morrison observed. watching Sarah attempt to climb a rock twice her height. She already is. Nora laughed, not moving to stop her daughter's exploration. Jack was nearby, ready to catch her if needed, but letting her test her limits. The old cabin still stood, weathered but solid. Nora had insisted they maintain it, this place where their love had first bloomed. Sometimes she and Jack would ride up alone, leaving Sarah with the Morrisons, to remember who they'd been and appreciate who they'd become. Hard to believe it's only been 2 years, Brackett said, joining Nora where she stood looking at the cabin. Seems like a lifetime ago I first read those ledgers you brought. It was a lifetime ago. Nora replied. We're different people now. Better people. She watched Jack lift Sarah onto his shoulders, her delighted squeals echoing off the mountains. Whole people, she corrected. Finally. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Elias produced a fiddle, and music filled the mountain air. Others joined in with harmonicas and spoons, creating the kind of impromptu celebration that marked frontier life. Jack couldn't dance properly. His injuries and natural reserve prevented that, but he swayed with Sarah in his arms while Nora leaned against his side. Play Shenandoah, someone called out, and Elias obliged. The mournful, beautiful tune drifted across the plateau. Nora felt Jack tense slightly. Music from the war years still affected him, but then he began to hum along, his damaged voice adding a rough harmony that somehow made the song more poignant. Later, as the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the gathering grew quiet. William Thornton, emboldened by whiskey and camaraderie, asked the question others had wondered. How did you do it? How did you forgive? Not just each other, but everything? Nora and Jack exchanged glances. It was Jack who answered, his words coming slowly but clearly. Didn't forgive. Everything. Some things. Unforgivable. But chose to look forward, not back. The past is a heavy burden, Nora added. We decided to set it down. Not forget it. It shaped us, but not carry it forever either. Sarah had fallen asleep against Jack's chest. Tiny fingers curled in his shirt. In the dying light, surrounded by friends who'd become family, the scene felt sacred somehow. That night, back in Haven Springs, Nora found Jack on their porch, whittling a toy horse for Sarah. The motions were meditative, wood curling away to reveal the shape within. Good day, she said, settling beside him. He nodded, setting down the carving to take her hand. Grateful, he managed. For all of it, even the hard parts? Especially those led us here. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to crickets and the distant sound of the town settling for sleep. Then Nora spoke. I want to write it down, our story, not for publication, but for Sarah, so she knows where she came from, what we overcame. Jack considered, then nodded slowly. Truth? All of it? The truth. She deserves that. Over the following months, Nora filled journal after journal with their tale. She wrote in the evenings after Sarah slept, Jack often sitting nearby, occasionally correcting a detail or adding his own perspective in his careful script. The writing proved cathartic, letting her examine their journey with the distance of time. The woman who'd stood frozen at Samuel's funeral seemed a stranger now. The desperate flight, the mountain cabin, the violence and fear, all of it had forged them into who they were meant to be. Jack's voice continued to improve with use and confidence. He'd never be an orator, but he could speak full sentences now without strain. More importantly, he'd found other ways to communicate, through his hands that gentled horses and crafted beauty from wood, through his presence that made others feel safe, through the love that shone in his eyes whenever he looked at his family. Sarah grew like a wildflower, bright and resilient. She had her mother's quick mind and her father's steady nature, a combination that served her well. When other children teased her about Jack's silence or the scars he bore, she faced them down with quiet dignity. My papa's the bravest man in the world, she'd say simply. He saved Mama, and he saves horses, and he saved me by being my papa." Nora returned to teaching, now with Sarah often playing quietly in the corner of the schoolroom. Her students thrived under her guidance, learning not just letters and numbers, but how to think, question, and dream. Some went on to universities back east, carrying with them the lessons learned in her simple classroom. The horse training business prospered. Jack's reputation spread beyond Haven Springs, bringing customers from neighboring towns. He hired 2 young men to help, veterans like himself who needed work that didn't require constant talk. Together they built an operation known for honest dealing and excellent results. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jack surprised Nora with a trip. Just the 2 of them. Sarah safe with the Morrisons. He wouldn't say where they were going, just helped her onto the train with a mysterious smile. They traveled west, through landscapes that shifted from mountain to desert to something she'd only dreamed of. The vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean. "California," she breathed, standing on the beach at Monterey, waves lapping at her feet. "You remembered. Promised," he said simply. "Said we'd see ocean together." They spent a week there, walking beaches, exploring tide pools, being simply Jack and Nora rather than parents and pillars of community. On their last night, as they watched the sun sink into the Pacific, Jack cleared his throat. "Want to say something?" He turned to face her, taking both her hands. "Thank you for seeing who I could be, for patience, for love, for Sarah, for life." "Jack," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Not done," he continued with effort. "Want to grow old with you, watch Sarah, become a woman, maybe grandchildren someday. Want all of it, with you?" "Yes," she said, though he hadn't asked a question. "Yes to all of it." They kissed there on the beach, salt wind tangling their hair. The vast ocean witnessed to promises that needed no ceremony to sanctify them. Back in Haven Springs, life resumed its rhythm. Seasons turned. Sarah grew. The town prospered. The Renner home became a gathering place. For Jack's veteran employees who needed a family dinner. For Nora's students who needed extra help. For anyone who needed reminder that broken things could be mended. One winter evening, as snow fell soft outside, Nora finished the last page of their story. She set down her pen and looked at the stack of journals, their love and pain and triumph captured in ink and paper. "Done?" Jack asked from his chair by the fire. "Done." He rose and came to read over her shoulder, seeing how she'd ended it. "We are not the people we were when this story began. Those scared, damaged souls died somewhere on the journey, and from their ashes rose something new. We are Jack and Nora Renner of Haven Springs, teacher and horseman, husband and wife, father and mother. We are proof that love can conquer fear, that gentleness can overcome violence, that 2 broken halves can create a whole stronger than either part. To our beloved Sarah, who will read this someday, you are the living symbol of that triumph. In you, our love takes form and walks the earth. Be proud of where you came from, not despite the struggles, but because of how they were overcome. The wild cries that once broke the town's sleep have become lullabies. The silent horseman has found his voice, and the banker's widow has discovered that the greatest wealth cannot be counted in coins, but in the moments of joy that fill an ordinary life made extraordinary by love. Jack wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. "Beautiful," he murmured. "True." From upstairs came the sound of Sarah calling out in her sleep. They went up together, finding her tangled in blankets, lost in some childhood dream. Jack smoothed her hair while Nora adjusted the covers, and their daughter settled back into peaceful slumber, standing there in the lamplit room, watching their child sleep safe and loved. Nora felt the last ghost of the past release its hold. They'd traveled so far from that cemetery in Dustwater, through danger and desperation, to arrive here, at home, at peace, at last. Jack took her hand, and together they went to their own room. Outside, snow continued to fall on Haven Springs, blanketing the world in pristine white, But inside the Renner home, warmth and love held winter at bay. They lay together in the darkness, no longer desperate or fearful, but with the deep contentment of two souls who'd found their way home to each other. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Sarah's boundless energy, horses to train, students to teach, lives to live. But tonight, in their bed earned through courage and kept through love, Nora and Jack Renner held each other close and knew that every wild cry, every silent tear, every desperate flight had been worth this. Peace, home, each other, always. Thank you all for listening to this tale from the Wild West. I hope Nora and Jack's journey touched your heart as it did mine. Please share in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to know where their story has traveled. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories of love, adventure, and triumph in America's frontier days. What did you think of Nora and Jack's love story? Share your thoughts below.